Hi everyone. Um, I want to talk briefly about the exam and make sure that I have covered my expectations for the exam and maybe how you should approach studying some of these things. The first question that I want to answer is when is the exam? The exam should be posted by next Wednesday, and it's not on a specific day of the week. Once it is posted, it will remain available to you throughout the week until the following or until until Sunday night. And you can take it anytime you want in that period. It um, it will only be available once though. So once you go in and take it, there's no way to get back in it. It's gonna lock you out at that point. So that means you have one chance to do a good job to perform well on the test. Um, in terms of content, that's the next thing I want to address. Anything we covered in class is appropriate content. So that means the 5 tag lectures, the 5 book chapter lectures, the book readings that go along with those lectures that have additional details. Those additional details are also content for the test. And then also the 2 papers we read, Naomi 2011 and Alho 2008, uh, both of those papers could be relevant to questions on the test in some way, shape, or form. So that is the content. A couple things that I would point out to you that might help you study. Um, if there is a spot where I talked for a long time about a process, I'm probably going to ask a short answer type question about that, or even a medium length answer question about that. If there is some sort of term and definition type thing, if I'm going to ask a question about that, it will be probably a multiple choice or fill in the blank type question. If there is a diagram that I want to ask a question about, it will probably be a picture of the diagram with certain elements of the diagram removed, and then it'll say maybe the rachis will be removed on a feather diagram, for example, and it'll be blanked out. You won't be able to see the word rachis, and it'll have an A there, and it'll say what is A, and then you have to write rachis or select rachis from a menu. It just depends on how I format it. Um, it might ask, what does the structure do? And then you have to also write in what the structure's purpose is. So that is sort of how that content can be looked at. When you look at the tag content, how can you study the tag content? The tag content is it's a lot of information. The lectures are short, but the quantity of information is it's a lot, right? You've got diets, conservation statuses, geographic distributions, uh, order, species, family, and common names. There's a ton of information there, and I'm aware of that. So how can you study for that? For identification, orders, families, species, common names, you just have to know them. Like you just have to learn that, hey, that's what a red crown crane looks like, or whatever. A good way to actually study that is to make a PowerPoint for yourself, where you just pull pictures off the internet, where you have slides and they don't have the names on them, and then you put the names for yourself in the comments of the slide, and then you go through and you try to identify them, and then you can check yourself by looking in the comments. So you basically make yourself like flashcards on a PowerPoint slide. That's a good way to study that until you learn those. And yes, all of the whole taxonomic thing is a part of the test. Like you will be asked for orders, families, species, and common names, so you have to know them. Um, and spelling does matter. I will tell you because a student reached out to me about this earlier today, and so we should address it. On Temminck's fruit dove, I very intentionally spelled Temminck's fruit dove Temminck's fruit dove because that's how the tag spells it. And in my mind, that made sense because it would alleviate confusion between my spelling and the tag spelling. And then a student that was doing a little more research on that particular species said, hey, this isn't how anyone else spells this. And they were 100% correct. The real spelling is Temminck, not Temminck. And that's because it's the bird's named for a guy whose last name is Temminck, the guy that was around in the 19th century and did uh, some ornithological work. So remember, though, that you can always just call it by its other common name, the pink-headed fruit dove. Um, so that's the identification portion of that. Uh, I will not ask you every single bird. It would be one very long test that was just birds. So don't expect, I don't know how many bird species we've covered so far, probably around 60, I think, is probably a reasonable estimate. There's not many more, it might be more than that, 60 to 70 birds. There's not many more than like a dozen or so in each group for the most part. Um, anyways, I will ask you some subset of identifications. There might be 10 identification questions. There might only be 6. There's a lot of stuff to cover on the test, so I can't ask you just to identify birds during the whole exam. Now, that's the identification part. What about all that other information? Because it's really not feasible to memorize conservation statuses, conservation reasons for conservation statuses, um, diets, global distributions, migration patterns, and habitat preferences for every species. I'm aware of that. Um, there's no reason to memorize all of that information, but when you look at the different groups, the different orders in particular, you should notice for the larger orders that we've covered, things like Gruiformes, for example, that there tends to be a similarity across diets. Columbiformes, most of them have a very kind of generally specific diet that they all kind of like. And there's little variations on those, but for the most part, there's a pattern that if you look at all the species in the group, you'll start to see like, oh man, all these species, they are kind of eating similar things in this particular order. The same thing is true of, to some extent, habitat types, right? Like a lot of columbiformes are somehow associated with forests, for example. And so you can look at the groups as as a whole and find the underlying pattern in those groups for the reasons for their conservation concern, for things like diet, for things like habitat. And you can even kind of do that for distribution. Distribution's a little more tricky um, because in some groups it's a little more varied than in others. But you can kind of look at groups like, okay, these species are African species, and kind of cluster them all together when you're studying them. Or these species are generally species of Indonesia, and maybe also associated with the Philippines or something like that, or generally found in East Asia, or generally found in South America, things like that. So you can kind of group a lot of the species into these clusters to help sort of think about their overall distribution. It's a lot of material, I know, but that should at least help go from I have to remember everything for every species to I have to kind of remember these things as sort of groupings and general patterns. That makes them much more manageable. Um, from the papers, I'm not going to ask any like hugely significant questions directly from the papers, but things that were in the papers, so like the integrated framework of species concepts and the ideas that Alho presents about the importance of diversity, those concepts are very relevant to some of the questions that could show up on the test. Um, yeah, so Other than that, some format stuff real quick. Again, it's a timed exam. So there's a time limit for the exam. I know some of you have extra time on exams. I have to figure out how to set that up in Canvas sometime over this weekend. And once I get that figured out, we'll get that set up for you as well. Um, the format, you're going to have multiple choice questions. You're going to see uh, multiple choice questions associated typically with particular terminology that you might have covered in different chapters. It could be related to things like feather structures or uh, different terms related to avian flight. Those would be some good places to pull some multiple choice questions. It could be related to terms that are in the book that I didn't cover in a lecture that you still should have read about and understand. So those are relevant. So that's multiple choice. You have some fill in the blank. Fill in the blank will be things like what is the order, family, um, scientific name, and common name of the species, and you'll have to fill them in. I expect you to spell correctly. I expect you to, um, when you're writing short answers, which is the next thing, you have short answer questions. I expect you to write in complete sentences. I expect you to write in paragraph form. I expect you to give a legitimate narrative for these things. And then there may be diagrams. And so diagrams would be like you have maybe a diagram of the feather. Some parts of the feather are blotched out, and you have to tell me what those parts are, or maybe what they do. So that's the format part. So we've covered when the test is, um, what content is on the test, and what the format of the types of questions look like, and the fact that it's timed. I think that should cover most of your concerns and questions for the exam. And if you have other questions, please reach out to me and I'll try to clarify.